Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war. Airland battle, the master plan behind the victory in Desert Storm. Without it, even the most powerful weapons are rendered useless. From the stalemate of World War I trench warfare, to the power of the Nazi blitzkrieg, to the firefights in the jungles of Vietnam, this is the quest for the ultimate war-fighting doctrine, Airland battle. Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war.
Land warfare has been revolutionized 4 times since the turn of the century. The first change was the denial of mobility in the stalemate of World War I. The second saw the restoration of mobility with tanks and aircraft in World War II. The third change can be seen as the defeat of technology by the guerrilla fighters of Vietnam. However, the fourth revolution in land warfare was the victory of technology in Operation Desert Storm. That success validated not only the sophisticated weapons, but also the U.S. Army's new war-fighting doctrine, the air-land battle. As forces arrived in Saudi Arabia, the United States Army prepared to fight a war like no other in its history. Highly trained forces with an incredible array of technology at their disposal. 5 weapons in particular were developed to help the Army execute the intricate and cohesive melding of air and ground forces known as air-land battle. The M1A1 Abrams main battle tank, the cornerstone of the ground forces. The M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, fast enough to keep the infantry alongside the tanks. In the air, the Apache attack helicopter, a flying fortress, can support the armored columns on the ground. The Black Hawk utility helicopter moves troops and artillery quickly. And the Patriot missile provides small crews with a very effective means of air defense. However, to win battles, an army needs more than equipment and highly trained troops. An army must have an effective framework or battle doctrine in which to operate in order to achieve victory.
Doctrine is the signally most important aspect of constructing a fighting force. It's the statement of how you intend to fight and win. In the case of land power, doctrine focuses all of the various operating systems that you have that need to be brought to a certain point at a certain time to achieve the intent of the commander. Doctrine is the script that brings all of that together.
After Vietnam, there is much assessment of what was done, what could have been done better, and there gradually grew what is come to be termed the air-land battle, in which the units of the Air Force and the Army and the Navy are integrated so that all of the assaults that are made are orchestrated to optimize them. And I think in both Panama and in Iraq, you saw the greatest exposition of the air-land battle theories.
Right now, all of the American air-land battle doctrine essentially centers on the orchestrated employment of 7 battlefield operating systems. And they are maneuver, fire support, command and control, intelligence, combat service support, mobility, counter-mobility, and survivability, and air defense. And we think by those combination of capabilities, if you ensure that they are integrated to achieve a focused purpose as defined by the script, as defined by the doctrine, we basically will have the capabilities such that whatever the intent of the commander is can in fact be enabled.
The shock action and the speed of our maneuver, which is air-land battle. We've been talking it in the Army for 20 years and then finally got the option to go out and see. This is what we're talking about. This is how it works. You synchronize everything, you get your artillery going, your attack helicopters going, your air going, all at a critical time and place with the ground forces, and it's going to happen. It's going to work.
The concept of combining different types of units to create a more effective force is hardly new. The Roman army used chariots to increase the mobility of their forces while still depending on foot soldiers for the main attack. As technology improved, cavalry, artillery guns, and infantry soldiers worked together on a more complex battlefield. Balloons added another dimension, allowing an army to spot enemy formations and prepare countermeasures or fire artillery shells deep into the battlefield. As forces began to mobilize for war in Europe, most military strategists assumed that World War I would be conducted the same way that battles had been fought since the times of Napoleon.
In the Franco-Prussian War, and then in World War I, countries were defending entire territories, the whole countryside, so they had these long lines that covered the entire front between their country and the other country. And the Germans, in the early part of World War I, thought they were going to achieve a breakthrough and destroy the French forces very quickly.
Indeed, the war began with a classic flanking maneuver devised by the German Chief of Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen. The German army swept through Belgium and into the northern part of France. As expected, French troops continued to take the most direct route to the front, unaware of Schlieffen's maneuver. The German forces completely encircled the French and won the first few encounters easily as they continued to move south. Fortunately for the French, the Kaiser's troops were exhausted after their 300-mile march, and there was little food left for the horses carrying supplies and towing artillery pieces. In fact, German forces cut their maneuver short, descending to the east of Paris instead of circling behind the city. The French army was now in position to launch a counterattack on the exposed German flank just 20 miles outside of Paris at the Marne River.
About the 30th of August, they were at Meaux on the Meuse River. And this was only about 20 or 30 miles from Paris. And this was where the Battle of the Marne took place. There were two Battles of the Marne. This was the first one. The French rushed out reinforcements. They had used taxi cabs. They had all the transport taken up. They used taxi cabs, brought enough infantry out there. They were finally able to stop the Germans at that point. That was the high point of the German advance into France. That was as far as they ever got. Now remember, by that time, the Germans, in less than a month, had moved around 350 miles from the German border all the way across Belgium and all the way across northern France that far. So their supply lines they just couldn't handle that type of thing that rapidly.
As the advance halted, the effects of recent technological improvements such as more accurate rifles, rapid-firing machine guns, and long-range high-explosive artillery shells could now be seen. Trains and trucks quickly brought more troops, guns, and supplies to the front. This war would certainly not be fought as the generals had planned. Unable to penetrate each other's defenses, both the Allied and German armies began to dig trenches to provide some protection before the next attack. But if technology was dictating a change in battlefield strategy, the generals weren't listening. The fighting continued. The trenches became deeper and longer until they stretched across virtually the entire front from the English Channel to the Alps. World War I became a war of attrition, where victories were measured in terms of enemy casualties instead of territory gained. Intense artillery and mortar fire, would precede a frontal assault by the infantry, who would soon become trapped in barbed wire, gunned down by machine gun fire, or blasted by enemy artillery. When these assaults failed, the generals assumed the enemy had not been properly softened up. Instead of one day of artillery barrages before an attack, there would now be 1 week or more. Such was the case at the Battle of Verdun.
It was fought in 1916, and it turned out to be the bloodiest battle of, I think, the bloodiest battle of all wars. The Germans launched a massive offensive towards Verdun, which was a heavily fortified city. The French immediately began to rush up reinforcements because this long barrage gave them plenty of warning, and they rushed up reinforcements, rushed them up. And the French started their counter barrages. And the battle raged on from February on up until June. It lasted for right at 5 months, and it just became a horrendous slaughter. The French lost around 550,000 men, and the Germans lost around 450,000 men in this battle. This is 1 million men. This was the largest, heaviest casualties in any battle in any war ever.
Months and years passed. The utter waste of life continued as the surviving troops suffered through the ordeal. The military leaders had no new strategy. Could technology come to the rescue?
Airland Battle will return on A&E.
As World War I dragged on, it became clear that the infantry needed some form of protection when making their assaults, something which could bring mobility back to the field of battle. The British worked in secret on an armored tractor-like vehicle, and on the open fields of Cambrai, they unveiled their revolutionary new weapon.
In the Battle of Cambrai, they had assembled about 400 tanks. They had their effect upon the Germans. They broke through, but the lack of exploitive methods, they no longer had a cavalry that they could pour through the hole that would have been effective, perhaps. So that, in effect, the tanks became mobile units for protecting infantrymen on their advance. And this was a retrograde step in the thinking of the advanced tankmen of the time, who saw it, as all the great tankmen did, as great penetrators of going behind the lines and breaking up the communications.
Planes were also emerging as a weapon which could open up the battlefield. They could be used to bomb enemy forces on the ground with small hand-dropped explosives, to scout deep behind enemy lines, or to deny the enemy the use of his plane. Eventually, they were even used together in larger formations.
Billy Mitchell organized the great 1,500 plane air fleet that was used in the San Miguel attack. And it was the first time that a large fleet had been used systematically to control a battlefield. And he divided them so that he had 500 airplane brigades on either side of the San Miguel salient, and systematically suppressed the German air, and then systematically beat up the German ground troops in a way that had never done before, and which really prophesied the future.
With the help of the tank and the airplane, the Allies were able to gain precious ground. They had been winning the battle of attrition thanks to a large number of reinforcements from America, and now they had the upper hand in mobility as well. However, the early versions of these two weapons hardly represented true mobility.
The bottom line was that we had surprise, had immediate success with air and tanks, but they really did not have the battlefield significance that they should have, because they were essentially new capabilities that were presented really without an encompassing doctrine that would ensure that they would be used effectively and efficiently to the purpose of the commander.
It was in the years between the world wars that the technological and tactical advances were made, leading to the restoration of mobility in World War II.
Between World War I and World War II, the Armored Division was, as far as we were concerned, was a new idea. You combine tanks and armored infantry, that would be infantry motorized riding in half tracks, and then you'd have armored artillery, that'd be self-propelled artillery. And you put those three arms together and then support them with engineers and signal and medics and maintenance and supply, and you had a completely self-contained unit. The British developed the concept simultaneously, and the Germans had developed this concept also. But the only problem was that we didn't have enough weapons, we didn't have enough money, The total ground forces in the Army between World War I and World War II were 136,000 men, 6,000 officers. And that just wasn't enough to train properly.
Most of the conceptual work on the evolution of the doctrine during the interwar period was done by the British. Some was done by the French. The Russians, under Marshal Tukhachevsky, were very, very advanced. And the Germans, of course, the Guderians and the Fullers. These were the individuals that, some of whom were noted in World War II, but they really did a lot of their major work during the interwar period. But this work, again, was really not being done within the United States.
It is ironic to think that Germany, the one country which was restricted by treaty from building any new weapons, was the most prepared to fight another war. France believed a defensive doctrine would protect it from any invaders and developed the Maginot Line, the chain of concrete and steel fortifications linked by underground tunnels. The French Army's offensive arsenal was no stronger than it had been at the end of World War I. Suddenly, in 1939, Hitler unleashed the new German warfighting doctrine as Poland became the first victim of blitzkrieg.
The concept and the practice of blitzkrieg had reached the point where the German army could virtually carry it out as a drill. They would suddenly lay down vast areas of fire from artillery pieces. They would be supplemented by dive bombers. They would be supplemented by the infantry mortars. Anything that could be brought to bear on one particular area of landscape where the unfortunate enemy was would be saturated. They would be saturated to such a point that when the armour moved forward, there was virtually nothing to stop it. It would pour through that gap.
As soon as the German ground forces began to move, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, took to the air, nullifying any possible threat from Polish air forces. Soon Germany's neighbors to the east had been crushed, and Hitler turned his attention to France in the west. Instead of trying to attack the Maginot Line directly, the German army simply swept around it and headed for Belgium instead. A well-coordinated attack using paratroopers and artillery crushed the fortress of Eben-Emael as Hitler's forces poured into France. Having outflanked France's static defense lines, the German army quickly moved towards Paris. The French army's defensive doctrine had failed, and its World War I vintage weapons were no match for the blitzkrieg.
Prior to the invasion of France in 1940, the British and French had more tanks than the Germans. Some of our tanks were very good, but we did not know really how to use our tanks. We tended to spread them too thin, where the Germans would concentrate their armour and use it en masse. We had the tanks, we had the artillery, but we could not really use them as a combined arms team. Therefore, we lost the Battle of France.
Soon Paris had been captured. The Allies had been caught on their heels, just as they had been in World War I. The small, under-equipped American army was in no position to offer immediate assistance. Germany had proved beyond a doubt that the key to future victories was the unlimited use of mobile, overwhelming firepower.
Airland battle will return on A&E.
In the spring of 1942, the German army once again proved that their doctrine of combining mobile ground units and supporting air forces was the key to victory, even against a numerically superior enemy force. General Erwin Rommel had only 561 tanks on hand, compared to over 900 for the British forces. But the Desert Fox overcame this disadvantage with superior tactics and executed the German strategy brilliantly.
He thoroughly understood the concept of using armored warfare. When the Italians got into trouble in North Africa, the Germans realized they were going to do something about it. So they sent Rommel in there with his Africa Corps to try to rescue the Italians who had already been beaten down by the British.
He realized that warfare in the open, unpopulated desert required a slightly different set of rules. As far as Rommel was concerned, there was always a flank to be turned, as mobility and firepower took on a heightened sense of importance.
Rommel was able to encircle and develop the British, and on these long runs, he just drove all the way back to El Alamein, which was not too far from Cairo.
Axis infantry units engaged the British forces in order to keep the Allied units pinned down behind their defensive line. This left the German tanks free to sweep around the British southern flank, and the panzer units were soon well to the rear of the opposition's static defense line, ready to cut off the forward British troops from their supplies and reinforcements. The British operated as scattered armored units, while the German and Italian forces fought in cohesive formations under central control, supported by the Luftwaffe. In addition, when the Allied armor units did attack in larger formations, they often employed a traditional British cavalry maneuver, charging straight at the enemy, line after line. Given such easy targets, the German tanks, anti-tank gunners, and dive bombers cut down a great number of Allied armor.
Fortunately, the British were able to bring in reinforcements, and there was a place just south there called the Quatara Depression, which was a big open, kind of like something, I guess you compare it to something like the Grand Canyon in this country. It was just a big open depression, just an insurmountable barrier as far as tanks and motorized troops are concerned.
This time, there would be no flank to maneuver around.
Fortunately, Montgomery came in there with his 8th Army and was able to build up sufficiently. So he had tremendous artillery power and tremendous infantry armor superiority over Rommel. And then, of course, by that time, the American army had landed in Casablanca and in Morocco. And so the American army came in from the west, and the British drove the east, and finally Rommel was caught in a trap. And the German army collapsed and was captured.
Despite Rommel's eventual fall, the battles in North Africa validated some basic doctrinal principles which still applied some 50 years later in Operation Desert Storm. The combination of local air superiority with mobile armor and infantry units under central control can lead to victory even when outnumbered. But if the battles in North Africa represented an early version of effective airland doctrine, the Allied invasion of Italy at the Anzio beachhead came to symbolize an ineffective battle plan and missed opportunities. In January of 1944, the Allies made an amphibious assault at Anzio, 20 miles southeast of Rome, in an attempt to cut off German communication and supply and break the deadlock in Italy. The landing itself was quite successful. The amphibious forces had achieved complete tactical surprise, with 90% of the assault force ashore after the first day. There was virtually no enemy resistance, and the forward units had soon reached their first inland objectives. But instead of continuing forward and exploiting their advantage, the armies were ordered to wait until the entire landing force was ready to move out. This delay gave German leaders a chance to maneuver their armies into position. What resulted was 4 months of bitter fighting, battles of attrition similar to the Western Front in 1917. Winston Churchill captured the essence of the Allied failure at Anzio when he said, "We thought we had hurled a wildcat ashore. All we got was a stranded whale." But the Allies learned from their mistake in Italy. Dawn on June 6, 1944, intense airstrikes and naval bombardments of the Atlantic Wall provided cover of invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord. The Allies were now on the offensive as the historic move across Europe began. The Allies, in fact, were basically following German doctrine as they combined aerial and infantry support of armored units. Like the Blitzkrieg, the Allied advance would depend on communication, mobility, and firepower. However, the Normandy region of France, covered in a patchwork maze of thick hedgerows, would present an immediate problem to the Allied advance.
When we first started fighting in Normandy, once we got off the beach, we had to fight through this hedgerow country. We break through one hedgerow, and the engineers would go in and dynamite the hedgerow, because the only way we could get through unless we used a bulldozer tank. We'd start an attack. We'd go maybe capture 2 or 3 fields, and by that time we'd been slowed down so much the Germans didn't know where the attack was coming. They'd counterattack when we were out on the flank, and they would overrun us.
Eventually, though, an inventive American soldier created a hedge chopping attachment which was fitted onto the front of tanks.
These hedge choppers, you put them in front of the tank, the hedge choppers so low the Germans couldn't see which tanks had hedge choppers and which ones didn't. And we could break through those hedgerows, and instead of breaking through, say, maybe 1 or 2 places, we could break through 10 places simultaneously, so it became an extremely effective weapon.
The armor units could finally advance effectively, and the Allies were poised to make a more rapid advance at the Battle of Saint-Lô.
The breakthrough at St. Lo will probably go down in history as probably one of the most significant battles of all time, because this was the first time that large masses of air power and artillery and infantry and armor were all coordinated together on such an extremely narrow front against such an extremely difficult target. The plan was to break up and envelop the German army on their western flank. To break through effectively, we had to be able to destroy the German reserve. Unless we could destroy those reserves in the rear and prevent a counterattack, we weren't going to break through that hedge without tremendous cost. The attack started out with a heavy bombardment. The first flight came with 900 B-26 bombers. Just far back you see were planes. We realized that once the breakthrough started, the armor was going to move, we hoped, very rapidly. And the infantry would not be able to keep up with them. And therefore, the flanks of the armored division were going to be exposed for maybe 3 or 4 hours. And until the infantry could get up and seal off these flanks, they assigned the Air Force a mission to create a bomb line. And any time the Germans tried to cross that bomb line, to attack them. Our division moved through the gap after the infantry had gotten through and cleared the line. C Company pulled over in the field to the right and went over to the edge of the bomb line. Unfortunately for us, just as we pulled in this damn field, a German tank and a German infantry group started to attack. Each artillery battery had a liaison officer from the Air Force. So he just picks up a damn radio and gives them my coordinates and tells them we're being attacked and overrun by some German tanks and to come in here and get the hell in there in a hurry. Here came these 2 P-47s, and they came screaming in at a real low altitude. I mean, they were less than 1,000 feet. And they started firing those machine guns over our head, and I saw those bombs let go, and I looked up there and I said, damn, those bombs are going to land right in our area. I mean, they let those bombs go at least 300 or 400 yards on the other side of us. Because the air pilots knew exactly what they were doing, and those bombs arched over the top, right over the top of our trucks and landed about 50 yards on the other side of our trucks in that field. There were bogey wheels, there were tracked, there were German helmets, there was rifles, there was all kinds of wheels and stuff flying through the air. It saved our day. The effect of the bombing completely obliterated the Germans. I don't know how many thousands of Germans were killed in that thing. I just have no idea. With the heavy air bombardment of the hedge choppers, we lost 2 tanks. Prior to that, trying to go 8 miles in the hedgerows, we'd lost 87 tanks. That was the difference between the air bombardment and the heavy artillery and the hedge choppers. I think that's what made the difference.
If you look at close air support, it was a repeat with American improvements and American materiel, basically to the blitzkrieg of the Germans. We paid them back in full with very, very significant operations involving mobile armored forces with the close air support that was provided.
The Americans were quickly becoming proficient at the rapid movement of a combined group of arms, ground and air forces working as one incredibly cohesive fighting unit.
Airland battle will return on A&E.
General Patton and Field Marshal Rommel exploited the potential of the technology they had at their command. The strategy and tactics they employed rewrote the book on land warfare, and certainly lived up to Napoleon's declaration that the art of land warfare is an art of genius, of inspiration. However, the advances in doctrine that were made in World War II would not necessarily apply to the United States' next conflict in Korea.
The greatest threat, literally, with the rapid demobilization after World War II was that we retained cohesive combat forces. When the forces were employed in Korea, the initial forces were not well trained, not manned to full strength, not fully equipped, had basically come out of occupation forces that were stationed in Japan and were defeated. And it was a very, very serious concern.
In addition, the UN forces were extremely outnumbered after the communist surprise offensive. Just 3 understrength U.S. Army divisions were on the ground in the early stages of the war, and they soon found themselves backed into the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula, defending the harbor at Busan.
Korea was basically a refight of World War II, but under significantly different terrain conditions in contrast to the situation we'd faced in Europe in World War II.
The mountainous terrain made mobile combined arms maneuvers almost impossible. Because the terrain presented a formidable challenge to the ground troops, effective support from the air was even more essential. Jet aircraft, which had emerged at the end of World War II, were now employed in large numbers. Forward air controllers on the ground called in increasingly accurate and lethal air strikes, allowing greater coordination between air and ground forces. The Korean conflict also marked the dawning of a unique union of air and ground forces. The helicopter demonstrated the ability to move ground forces over terrain features and place them behind the enemy or on its flanks. But the actual number of helicopters available was relatively small, and the development of airmobile tactics was still in its early stages.
So if you look at Korea, very difficult to find, any single aspect from the issue of doctrine that really stands out as being innovative and of particular importance. It was important as a major deployment of land power resources from the United States overseas, something that had not been deterred by nuclear weapons, but from the standpoint of evolving American doctrine, it was not that significant. There was innovation that was beginning during that period. For example, what will helicopters be used for? Will helicopters be armed? What have you? This, of course, led to the innovation that was the Air Assault Division, which had just basically completed its development when we started into Vietnam.
When the pilots of the 101st Airborne Division whirled away from the deck of the USS Iwo Jima in 1965 to their base in South Vietnam, they foreshadowed the role of the helicopter not only as a weapon, but as the symbol of the United States operations in Vietnam.
The situation in Vietnam was not as much an inadequacy of innovation or technology. It was more a situation where the American Army at the time was learning the process of counterinsurgency or combating revolutionary war. We essentially were fighting more of a conventional land power conflict. The North Vietnamese were essentially fighting a revolutionary war. But the real issue was one of almost 2 ships passing in the night as to the nature of the war that was being fought. But in terms of effect on the development of our doctrine, Vietnam was not greatly different than anything we had done in Korea or World War II, except for the introduction of air mobility.
The helicopter had truly come of age, and air mobile tactics, including the use of newly formed air cavalry units, proved to be quite effective. A considerable number of troops could now be placed anywhere they were needed on the battlefield, regardless of the terrain. Artillery would assist them from fire support bases located throughout the country. But in most cases, after the fighting was over, the troops would head back to their base camps, and the enemy, which had been beaten back, was now free to return to their original positions. Despite American technological superiority, military planners in the Army did not develop an effective battle doctrine to counter the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. There was no front to break through, no flank to maneuver around, no clear battle lines at all. One thing was certain, though: technology alone could not win a war. A clearly defined battle doctrine was essential for victory.
Airland battle will return on A&E.
As the U.S. Army struggled to leave behind the memory of Vietnam, it was clear that reorganization was needed and future goals needed to be set.
An organization, Training and Doctrine Command, was established with a focused responsibility to not only develop the doctrine, but basically to make it all tie together, what we called the concept-based requirement system. In other words, develop the concept of how you intend to fight and then make everything else fit with that concept.
With decreased defense spending, the Army would need to become smaller, yet at the same time more efficient. Against a numerically superior Soviet force, the U.S. Army needed to be prepared to fight outnumbered and win. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War provided the Army with a clear example of just how lethal the modern battlefield could be.
Yom Kippur in 1973 could not have come at a more auspicious time. We quickly realized that the advent of new weapons, such as the anti-tank guided missile, that the destructiveness of the modern battlefield was far beyond what we had thought it had been in the past. The Russians have outgunned, so we realized that we had some serious catching up to do. That was the period, 1971 through 75, 76, when literally the American Army went back to the drawing board.
As the rebuilding began, 5 weapon systems in particular were targeted as being essential to the execution of the emerging Airland doctrine. The tank was the undisputed king of land warfare, and therefore received top priority among the Big Five, as they had come to be known. The M1 Abrams eventually replaced earlier models as the Army's new main battle tank. Likely to operate against a larger force, mobility, protection, and firepower took on added importance. Lightweight Chatham armor meant that the Abrams, at 45 miles per hour, was fast enough to outmaneuver most enemy tanks while still protecting its highly trained crew. The Arab-Israeli conflict had demonstrated the effectiveness of infantry operating alongside the tanks. Therefore, the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle was developed as the companion vehicle to the M1 Abrams. The Abrams and the Bradley give the Army a tactically capable, well-protected, and highly lethal armored force. The AH-64A Apache attack helicopter was designed to give the Army additional anti-armor capability in order to defeat larger Warsaw Pact tank forces. The Apache is highly maneuverable. It can fly close to the ground day or night, and it is more survivable against enemy fire than earlier models. To complement the new attack helicopter, the UH-60A Black Hawk utility helicopter was developed. It can transport an 11-man infantry crew or a 105mm howitzer and its crew and ammunition. The Black Hawk is faster and quieter than earlier models, and combined with the Apache, gives the Army a potent force designed to outmaneuver a more powerful enemy. The 5th of the Big Five weapon systems is the Patriot air defense missile. It is compact and more mobile than previous air defense systems and can be operated by a smaller crew. Its anti-missile capabilities have become well known, but its main objective is to assist the air forces in achieving air superiority, which is vital to the success of air-land battle. Air superiority allows Airland to win the deep battle behind the front lines, where communication and command centers can be disrupted, enemy reinforcements can be weakened before reaching the front line, and supplies can be delayed or destroyed. The Big Five, as well as other recently developed weapons systems, were designed to execute the close and deep battle requirements of Airland doctrine. When combined with highly trained volunteer soldiers, all working to achieve the goals of Airland battle, the U.S. Army has all the ingredients for victory.
For the first time, doctrine has essentially led the development process. In other words, we decided how it was that we wanted to fight in the future, air-land battle, and then we developed everything else to make it fit that concept and then that doctrine.
But even the best laid plans still need to be validated by actual experience. The 1989 invasion of Panama provided an early indication of Airland's potential.
Just cause, the operation in Panama, basically overwhelming force to achieve decisive victory, which happens to be our current national military strategy, is precisely that. Multiple simultaneous night assaults, extraordinarily complex to pull off, but basically taking place across the whole theater of operations such that the opponent was absolutely paralyzed. It was fully a joint operation. It was designed to be decisive, and it was to be essentially by the application of overwhelming force. That's what you saw really for the first time in Panama.
However, Operation Desert Storm represented the true culmination of airland battle doctrine. Years of weapons procurement, training, and tactical planning would now come to full fruition. An important goal of airland battle is to be prepared to win the first battle of the war, something the U.S. has regularly failed to do in previous wars. Aided by 6 months of undisturbed supply and troops buildup, the coalition forces were poised to strike. In order to minimize potential casualties for the U.S. and to keep the Iraqi army off balance, the Air Forces began an intensive campaign primarily targeting vital elements of the deep airland battlefield. Enemy command facilities were bombed, as well as communication centers, bridges, aircraft hangars, weapons plants, and reserve units. The incredible accuracy of smart munitions was a far cry from the saturation bombing runs of World War II. As the ground war began, the true integration of air and land forces occurred as planned.
Now, some people have said that air-land battle didn't exist because the air war was too isolated and too much in advance of the land battle in Iraq. But I don't believe that's the case. It's true that the air war was over an extended period of time before the land battle took place. But when the land battle took place, it was truly an extension of the air-land concept.
The armored units, with infantry and tanks side by side, sped forward, protected by attack helicopters in the sky. Artillery prepared the way, engineers breached the Iraqi defenses, and fighters controlled the skies as the fast and powerful U.S. forces executed their Hail Mary sweep.
We crossed in a tremendous feeling of this huge mechanized force, tremendous firepower and lethality with the Cobras going over from the Cav Squadron. And you looked around you and there were hundreds upon hundreds of tracked vehicles all moving north. And that juggernaut went all the way to the Euphrates River Valley. It was incredible.
The Hail Mary sweep was a classic flanking maneuver, harkening back to the Schlieffen Plan of World War I. But unlike the German army of 1914, the coalition forces had the technology and supplies required to complete the maneuver. Thanks to the Air Force's destruction of much of the Iraqi communication system, the sweep went off without a hitch.
We had Iraqis tell us, "You don't fight fair." And we said, "What do you mean we don't fight fair? You got in behind us." I said, "What do you want me to do?" "Well, all our defenses are here facing towards Basra, and you came in from Al-Nasiriyah behind us. Sue me, you know. Get in a POW cage, be happy."
The Iraqi forces had been completely overwhelmed. Coalition casualties had indeed been kept to a minimum, and the U.S. Army's air-land battle doctrine had been validated. 20 years of rebuilding had paid off. The Army had operated as a small, smart David while defeating the larger Goliath. The land battle is rapidly becoming more complex and technologically oriented. Using weapons of even greater sophistication, revolutionary changes are approaching, and as a result, the form and the shape of a future battlefield is difficult to predict. It is certain that no single weapon system can be fielded to cope with all the battlefield's requirements. So only through teamwork and cooperation between the armed forces can weaknesses be overcome and victory won.
tomorrow. How many had to die to blaze a trail through the untamed jungle? The Japanese enslaved thousands to build a bridge on the River Kwai on an all-new time machine. Now stay tuned for A&E's An Evening at the Improv, next on A&E.